I'm very glad to present our excellent panelist, José Carlos Calix from Brazil. Boa tarde, José Carlos.
Boa tarde.
Jennifer Log from USA. Good morning, Jennifer. And David Morgan from UK. Good afternoon, David.
Hi.
The three of them will be discussing the phenomenon of fake news and the mechanism of massive influence on the population. Before handing over to the panelists, I would like to explain briefly the format of how this webinar is going to work. We will have an hour and a half in total. In the first section of the webinar, each of our panelists will share with us their ideas, their thoughts, and their own point of view on the subject that is gathering us today, fake news. We'll speak. The papers from all of our panelists are available for you to download. The second section of the webinar will be a question and answer section devoted to the free exchange of ideas and comments with panelists and attendees. If you'd like to ask a question, please write it on the box that you will find on the right side of your screen. And questions only will be answered in the last half hour of the webinar. I apologize in advance because everyone's question or comment will be able to be aired due to our time constraint and the number of people present. So, well, now we are ready to begin. I am delighted to introduce our first speaker, José Carlos Calix, training analyst of the Porto Alegre Psychoanalytical Society and present director of training of its institute, professor at the New York University, member of the scientific committee of the Jean Laplanche Foundation, Institut de France, honorary member of the Mexican Psychoanalytic Association, editor of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis by Latin America, and at the moment, member of its editorial board, coordinator of the Working Party on Comparative Clinical Method, former president of the Porto Alegre Psychoanalytical Society. The title of José Carlos' presentation is A Psychoanalytic Glance at Fake News. José Carlos, over to you.
Thank you, Maria Eugenia. It's a pleasure to be here with you and all our colleagues and the colleagues that are attending us. Thank you very much for the invitation, Mariano. It's a very important subject, and it's a pleasure to be discussing here. So, Maria Eugenia has already said that my paper is a psychoanalytic glance at fake news. Fake news is a recent expression that designates and explains the idea of a hoax news. The phenomenon has always existed, but after World War I, with the progress of mass communication marketing strategies, it gained volume, social, financial, and political relevance with repercussions in all areas of culture. Fake news is created and disseminated with the intention of deceiving its receiver, altering his construction of the perception of reality and favoring the design of a new reality with a strong element of manipulation. The creator's gains are varied from narcissistic satisfaction to relevant financial and political gains. The expressive development of communication in the 21st century, the deepening of marketing strategies and technological advances with the new media resources, social or anti-social platforms, speed, the decentralization of the origin of information and cultural changes came together in the explosion of this phenomenon around the world. Its extensive propagation by individuals, groups, institutions, governments, and the use of robots, algorithms, and other instruments for its creation and dissemination make it impossible at the moment to assess the amount or the proportion spread every minute concerning news from reliable and sustainable sources, or better, substantiated sources. However, significant data were published in the Science magazine by a group of researchers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 2018, noting that fake news spread significantly further, faster, being more pervasive and more replicated than all other categories of information, regardless of the fact that it was initially propagated by robots. According to the researchers, this data implies that fake news spreads more than substantiated news because humans, not robots, are more likely to spread it. The fake news phenomenon has post-truth as a conceptual basis, a linguistic structure that has always existed throughout history, but it was named, according to the Oxford Dictionary, by the increasing frequency of its identification in 1992. In 2016, it was chosen as the word of the year by the same dictionary, which defines it as a utterance that produces meanings without objective substrate, which are imposed by the emotional appeal, by the power of persuasion, or by the authority or credibility of those who formulate them. No communication phenomena of this magnitude and with these characteristics would be possible were it not for a specific human receptivity to its properties in the individual or collective context. We are all acquainted that adhesive personalities, ones with affinities for romantic and catastrophic, people who are dominated by resentment or fraternal conflicts, as well as pathologies of the narcissistic spectrum that have in this mixture the tendency of attacking reality in many ways, including the attack on another human being, in which individually I think collaborates with the phenomena we are focusing on. However, its magnitude, constancy, and its insertion in a set of manifestations of the attack of reality that includes the disdain of other human allow us to conjecture that fake news is a symptom of a contemporary group mentality. Possibly, we're talking about something from the culture and its action on the individual, on the individual psyche. I will use Jean Laplanche's model, which seems to me quite integrative between these areas and with possibilities of high heuristic for the psychoanalytic conjecture in question. But however, I would not be able to explain it now. If anyone has interest, we can discuss it afterwards in the question and answers. What I want to highlight are the two constituents of our contemporary myth: the post-truth, fake news, and the fantasy of absolute freedom, freedom without limits. To clarify the later context of and its importance, I make a brief historical summary based on previous work of mine. At the beginning of the 20th century, a relevant epistemological revolution took place when new observational biases determined the loss of the universality of theories, with the growing importance of individuality, subjectivity, the participation of the observer experience, intersubjectivity, complexity, interpretation as an instrument for apprehending reality, intuition, and, as already said, the end of certainties, which significantly altered the world view of most thinkers in the various knowledge branches, and from which Freud was one of the precursors. It has been influencing the mentality since then. The new myth created included the element that the simplicity of the world had been taken away from us, that the notion of certainties and even truth had disappeared, and that therefore the illusion of security with historical structures was denied to us. This new cultural configuration led us to a new and significant helplessness. If culture, as Freud said in 1930, was a poor modulator of our destructiveness and kept discontent in an unstable balance, with a continued need to manage the individual collective, at the end of the third part of the 20th century, this conversation becomes progressively more difficult, with an even greater reduction in its protective role. The loss of security in historical structures, I point out examples of the growing failure of traditional religious institutions and the meta-narratives as universal truth, encourages individuality, contemporary social tribalisms, the polarization of ideas, and changes in power and domination settings. Even the state's nation begin to lose power to the market and to the new constructions of truth, diluting the notion of violence as control, altering the discontent in the civilization by increasing the insecurity and uncertainty. The new social and cultural configuration offers less protection against individual and collective destructiveness, therefore favoring resources for narcissism. Hyper-technology has helped to shift the balance between pleasure and reality, dramatically favoring illusion, adding to the myth of unlimited pleasure and to omnipotence. The idea that we completely dominate nature, being able to modify everything from genetics to supposedly our psychic and physical sufferings of any kind, begins to predominate and come into conflict with the myth of solidarity and sustainable progress. The easy, fast, cheap, and pleasurable have come to occupy the dominant mentality, becoming associated with the knowledge evolution that accompanies hypertechnology. I highlight the thoughtful essay on postmodernity by Jean-François Lyotard involving the radical relativization of the truth concept. Lyotard develops the idea that the loss of explanatory macrosystems, including Marxism and psychoanalysis, considered capable of universally revealing the truth of the human condition, places the world into postmodernity. For this author, this is characterized by the arrival of a post-industrial society understood as a gigantic network of linguistic games in which information has become the most important source of power, domination, and economic strength. Frederick Jameson, expanding on Lyotard's ideas, introduces the concept of crisis of representation, where if the facts are unknowable, their interpretation are more relevant than they are. Second, and if there are no criteria to validate the interpretations, all of them can be true. Third, therefore, the one that convinces us and convinces the interlocutor is more valuable. Lyotard and Jameson's reflections anticipate the concept of post-truth and its instrument, fake news. The current means of social communication have the ability to bring together groups, tribes, that in other circumstances would never have the opportunity to do so. Suicidal people, pedophiles, international terrorist networks, self-mutilators, criminals in general, all groups interested in power began to proclaim, disseminate, and impose their truths, and oppose to the truths that have been structured by the world until then. The wave of occasional truths without recognizable foundations, imposed by the force of persuasion, by the new power organizations, by the favoring of the illusion of unlimited pleasure, and by the new tribal fragmentation structure, creates the post-truth world. If we cannot seek the truth, all hypotheses in the current mentality are considered of equal value and scope, with a significant power to confuse and destroy concepts and structures. The idea that this is my truth begins to be imposed, boosted by the power of diffusion and unlimited persuasion, determined by the full force of the new mass communication. From this new force, I can impose my truth. Opinion on complex topics become free, and everyone has the right to have an opinion, regardless of the number of variables involved. Absorption that composes it and the relationship between them. It is what I have called opinions pornography in 2003, due to its direct relation with the discharge's pleasure, its excitatory value, disconnection from the psychic structure, and therefore the loss of the creation of meanings. Although the interaction between myths can mean that a portion of the population is not dominated by this new mentality, the tendency influenced by the seduction of unlimited pleasure and by the psyche's denial is the one that predominates. The phenomenon applies to all relationships. In my knowledge, they lead us to the liberation of individual and collective violence that go against social order, and in its most radical form, against any regulator. In opposition to the apparent privilege that we live in relation to other moments in history, that we should be living in a place which is not so violent and not so complicated. The new helplessness, the illusion of unlimited pleasure, of unlimited power, and the post-truth narrative lead to the culture of disregard for the order, to the divorce of the corporeal and the self, the culture of narcissism. The idea is that we will be immortal without suffering or pain, or the trial of growth and maturation will no longer make psychic efforts to influence our destiny, our bodies, our minds, will no longer limit our pleasure, and everything will depend on our will and powers of enforcement. In this new liberation mentality, we will be free from all our incompleteness. The representational body is denied and even foreclosed at this cycle, and as is psyche. The world created by this mentality is of pseudo-intimacy, as I called in 2017, where the intimate relationship with the object is replaced by its simulacrum, its phenomenological similarities, social pacts, agency, secrecy, sex, and etc. Like every myth symbolic structure, language and discourse are modified to express it. In addition, there is a change in the subject's relationship with his speech. Discourses are often not taken as something that opens a reflection. They tend to reflect a single discourse favoring radicalization. Many patients do not have questions about themselves, but answers adapted from the current discourse and social categories without genuine curiosity. Without consciousness, the search for absolute freedom places people in an inverse relationship of intense submission, including certain current psychoanalytic practices and thoughts. A new cultural discontent includes the tension between how much the individual, with his hyper-individuality, must renounce to integrate into the world, and how much society must concede to the particularities and idiosyncrasies of each hyper-individuality without getting disintegrated. A world of narcissistic pacts, social collusion, media popularity, and I without I, or me without me, and ethics without ethics. With the contemporary tribal structure, the illusion of unlimited pleasure, and the logic of displaced and diluted domination attributed to the individual and fragmented groups, an increasing number of new exclusionary categories are created. The level of intolerance and prejudice between groups increases, as does the violence between them. However, in the same logic that just described, the symbolic myth created from the excluded opposition also creates the prestige fetish and the discourse of the banished. The first ones naturalize an exclusion, humiliation, and abuse. For example, the cancellation phenomenon of professional and even family social groups and networks. And the second one gathers together legions of resentful and wronged people because they feel deprived of an illusory completeness attributed to the group from which they feel deprived, and often in other areas. These groups tend, at present, to indiscriminately naturalize all relationships, especially those that are steeped in the inequalities and social disconnections. Like everyone who is resentful and wronged, they use the narrative that the world owes them and they have the right to demand reparation, albeit its increasingly violent ways, increasing the breadth of destructiveness. Furthermore, in these new narcissistic structures of domination and their totalizing discourses, there is a tendency to politicize all forms of human relationships and to naturalize those that are sheltered in their discourses and to demonize those that escape them, even in their arguments in favor of plurality and diversity, and narratives tend towards unicity and excluding. The population subjected to an excess of information due to the overload of the media and social networks by the post-truth phenomenon and by the exposure to complexity finds it difficult to have references, including identity reference, capable of maintaining a reasonable level of security, support of historical structures, and the notion of continuity. This becomes more a function of repetition than the construction of a psychic temporality with expectation of the future. The only force capable of opposing the preponderance of these non-structuring myths is the recovery of the first installation of the libidinal investment with the linking power. It's our duty as psychoanalysts, and in my view, our greatest possible contribution to contemporary society, to bring the topic to discussion and reflexively assist in the arduous search for solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose Carlos. Very interesting ideas to discuss afterwards. I'll go straight to our second speaker. It is a pleasure for me to introduce Jennifer Logg. She's a candidate at the St. Louis Psychoanalytic Institute, professor at Southern Illinois University, graduate program director for diversity and equity in education, She did her PhD in philosophy of education at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Master and Bachelor of Arts, University of Toronto. The title of Jennifer's talk is Anti-Social Media, Manufactured Hostility and the Demise of Democracy, on the importance of developing psychoanalytic sensibilities in education. Jennifer, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Jose Carlos. Part of my project is to ask, what do teachers and educators do in navigating this narcissistic culture of disregard, where, like your patients, students come to classes armed with answers and an aversion to questioning? So I argue for the importance of developing psychoanalytic sensibilities in education. It seems clear that we are witnessing what seems to be an unprecedented increase in the spread of fake news, alternative facts, and effective feedback loops that have hate on the rise, increasing left-right divides. Experts of disinformation operations reveal that all fake news, whether motivated by profit logic, desire for political power, or just the power of pulling a scam, works by mobilizing negative affect. Because fake news does not work on a rational level, educators need to ask, how can we invite students into discussion about effective disinformation operations that incite hostility and deliberately fostered stupidity? In this talk, I highlight 4 psychoanalytically informed pedagogical strategies that help to more adequately engage emotions in the classroom. 1, prioritizing the freedom to feel. Over and above, I think, freedom of thought, and what's always fought on at least college campuses is the right to freedom of speech. 2, I stress that developing the capacity to mourn loss is essential if we want to invite students and teachers alike to grapple with difficult knowledge. 3, I urge that mobilizing a knowing ignorance can become an antidote to the proliferating investment in various forms of structural ignorance and fake news. 4, I suggest use of narrative fiction in film and literature as a promising pedagogical approach. Strategy 1, promoting the freedom to feel. Despite its unique position in being able to address the emotional world of learning and not learning, psychoanalytic discourse continues to be marginalized in educational theory and practice. One notable exception to the defensive refusal to engage psychoanalytic theory in teacher education is Arthur Gersild's groundbreaking work, When Teachers Face Themselves. This was in 1955 and really hasn't gotten much shrift, so I want to highlight some key elements here. Gersild brings to light that the emotional life of teachers, and he explores their defenses against it. He emphasized that much of what is called thinking is governed by undisclosed feelings. We need to be able to recognize how feeling influences thought if the intellect is to be able to function freely. And yet, the majority of schooling in academic life centers the notion of freedom of thought. But isn't it just as or even more important to nurture the freedom to feel? The defense against negative affect can take many forms, such as projecting it onto others, viewing it as pathology rather than everyday reality, flying off the handle too easily, or being unable to take criticism, to name but a select few. When defenses are unleashed in classrooms, learning shuts down, and the impetus to investigation becomes thwarted. When we invite students to reflect on taboo topics like systemic racial injustice, state violence, structural and subjective forms of ignorance, or their investment in what appears to be fake news, we should expect defense and resistance and learn how to work through it. Engaging students in discussion about the emotional world of learning is a productive way to begin any semester. Making the human capacity to deploy defense against discomfort part of class conversation from the outset can help to prevent them from becoming aggressively strengthened. I have found that starting a semester with Chapter 2 of Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents leads to fruitful classroom dialogue about the ways in which each of us defends against anxiety-inducing feelings and ideas. Life as we find it, Freud writes, is too hard for us. In order to bear it, we cannot dispense with palliative measures. He names 3 such strategies: powerful deflections, which cause us to make light of our misery; substitutive satisfactions, which diminish it; and intoxicating substances, which make us insensitive to it. In my experience, students become enthusiastic in the attempt to provide examples of each of these defensive tactics that they themselves may have engaged in, those they have seen in others, and the strategies that are encouraged and reinforced in our culture more generally. They have addressed topics ranging from how some parents and teachers are unable to see flaws in or the struggles of their children and or students, and vice versa. They've mentioned alcoholism, binge drinking, and addiction to social media as strategies with which to avoid intimacy. We have discussed how our consumerist society has us defending against aging, feeling sad, our mortality, and pretty much anything and everything that makes us uneasy or uncomfortable. Strategy 2, on developing the capacity to mourn. Psychoanalysis invites the freedom to come to new understandings about what we've been through, to feel it fully, to mourn the tragic events in our lives, and to move forward with all the knowledge, wisdom, and courage that facing the truth entails. And yet, our cultural norms have it so that when we discover that life brings suffering, capitalism offers a product, a service, or a drug to help us forget the suffering, avoid it, resist it, deny it. Aging, fear, sadness, loss, American capitalism offers a hypnotic treatment. As a result, too many of us experience discomfort, a contradictory idea, a hostile remark, a gender difference, a cultural norm or political opinion different than our own as a trauma that must be removed at all costs. As a culture, we are suffering from the loss of sadness. Our culture pathologizes normal sorrow while our lives are characterized by loss. Back in 1967, Alexander and Marguerite Meisterlich explored the psychic defenses against guilt, shame, and remorse of Germans in the aftermath of Nazi atrocities. A central theme of the book is the project of working through, remembering and mourning the horrifying events, one's own participation in them, and thereby emerging with greater openness to reality, detaching oneself from repetitive denial and avoidance of our common capacity for complicity and the suffering of loss. The authors write of mourning as the psychic process by which we learn to cope with the loss or a nation cope with the catastrophe in its history. And this working through, they emphasize, is simultaneously an intellectual and emotional process. While it took the Germans decades to make reparations for the wrongdoing in their past, they have done a better job at confronting the evils of their history than have Americans, argues Susan Nyman, who shows that American culture prefers narratives of progress, victory, and happy endings, and that lost with this tendency is the ability to express emotions that are fundamental to our humanity. American students seem to know more about the evils of the Holocaust than they do about the evils of the slave trade, and they neglect to register how the brutal 400-year history of racial terror is extending into our present. Rather than fixating on the often unexamined pursuit of happiness, as many Americans are admonished to do, we might come to see sadness as an emotion that potentially binds us. Sandra Buechler argues that sadness cleanses, acquainting us more nearly with all it means to be a human, binding us to each other while it sharpens our appreciation for joyous moments. We need to foster in students a strong tolerance for sadness and loss, as they will always be close at hand. We need to keep this in mind as we invite students to confront past and present realities they do not wish to learn about. Strategy 3, on knowing ignorance. Andrew Bennett's concept of knowing ignorance is another important intervention against defensive, rigid habits of thinking. Knowing ignorance is the cultivation of a literary imagination to invite the embrace and exploration of the condition by which we are all beset, namely the state of ultimately not knowing. Part of what it means to be a human is to grapple with ignorance. What is the meaning of life? How did we get here? And where are we going? Or even questions like, what are you thinking? Bennett's concept of knowing ignorance is a call to approach texts and life with our ignorance in mind. Ignorance cannot be eliminated, but it can be directed towards new ways of reading, thinking, and being in the world. One helpful way to rediscover our capacities to tolerate ambiguity and cultivate curiosity might be to heed Bennett's call to step into the literary imagination and linger in what poet John Keats calls negative capability, the capacity for remaining in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact, logic, and reason. What we learn from Bennett is that we need to unlearn desire for certainty and cultivate a disposition of curiosity. Aspects of the human condition stymied by mainstream K-12 education, enamored as it has become with the cult of efficiency, accountability, measurement, and productivity. Knowing ignorance is an important strategy as we try and repair a misremembered history and relinquish dreams of mastery, superiority, and invulnerability, some of the driving forces behind fake news and misinformation campaigns. Strategy 4, using narrative fiction to engage the literary imagination. I have found that students become much more engaged in transformative dialogue about divisive topics through stimulation of the literary imagination. I supplement my curriculum with poems, short stories, and film. Characters in fiction can be an excellent template for analysis and assessment of the predicaments people have found and continue to find themselves in. Mainstream history books fail to capture the intricate dynamics of unreliable narration, defense mechanisms, the dialectics of knowledge and ignorance, the lived realities of violent oppression and fierce resistance against it. Teachers and students alike can be invited to explore and interpret the lives, defenses, conflicts, and circumstances they encounter in fiction to explore the past and themselves more fully. Poetry and fiction invite critical reflection on what it means to be a member of the human condition, what it means to be caught in the contradiction between wanting to know and wanting to ignore. We get an intimate portrayal of how minds work with the use of narrative fiction. In closing, in learning to teach with psychoanalytic sensibility, we stay close to the emotional situations of learning that magnify what divides the conflicted subject and highlight the human condition of wishing to learn as much as we wish to resist new and difficult knowledge. We can engage these dilemmas collectively, where rather than searching for a bias-free truth, we can ask, who do I trust and why? Where does their bias lie? What is the purpose of this source of information? Who is the intended audience? And what is the underlying message? More importantly, if what I am encountering is inciting fear and anger in me, is it justified or is it designed to do just that, and to what end? We need to invite conversation and reflection about how we are attracted to what feels true and begin the process of collaborative dialogue, productive disagreement, and analysis, not just of sources of information, but the affects that are attached to them. We want a desire-free truth, so if we realize desire is part of truth, we might learn how to read it better. Thank you.
I can't hear you, Maria. I can't hear you, Maria. No, still can't hear you. Jennifer and Jose, can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, for your presentation. And your proposal, your approach is very interesting because you address this with strategies to what to do with this issue of fake news. Now we will go on with our third speaker, David Morgan. He's a consultant psychotherapist and psychoanalyst fellow of the British Psychoanalytical Society. He is also a training analyst supervisor at the British Psychoanalytic Association. He worked as a consultant psychotherapist in the NHS and in private practice as a psychoanalyst for 25 years. He is chair of the Political Mind seminars at the London Institute of Psychoanalysis. His recent research has focused on the psychological implication for whistleblowers. He has also presented a podcast called Frontier Psychoanalysts. He is the editor of 2 books on the unconscious in political and social life. The title of his talk is Most People Don't Really Want to Know the Truth. David, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much, Jose and Jennifer, for 2 excellent papers. Jennifer, I found your paper very moving indeed and really spoke to me. And I think probably fills in some of the gaps in my paper about what you do about people's attraction to fake news and how you build in another level of thinking, which is what my paper is addressing. So I think in relation to your paper, I start off with a bit of poetry, a bit of literature. What are the words by Audre Lorde, who people may know of, black poet in America? What are the words you do not yet have? What do you need to say? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own until you will sicken and die of them still in silence? Lorde's words from your silence will not protect you situate real thinking and narrative as central to recovery, as in psychoanalysis, and I think is central to recovering from our addiction at the moment to fake news. Fake news is an attack on complex thinking and genuine curiosity, which I think Jennifer was highlighting in her approach to education. My quote at the moment is, "I think, therefore I am," by Descartes, has become, "I tweet, therefore I am," by David Morgan. Okay. I surmise that fakery, jiggery, pokery, propaganda, and downright lies have been a feature of human communication forever. The powerful, the deranged, and the obsessed have always had the drive and means to proclaim untruths and manipulate others. It was ever so. But what was never ever so is the proliferation of means through which fakery can be promulgated and the speed it now happens. Even 25 years ago, pre-rampant internet social media, the lies had to get into print to be handed out to be read and digested. Many of us trusted our chosen print sources, our esteemed newspapers and commentators, and in London, the good old BBC. But today we turn to the internet for everything. We have a multitude of news outlets, gossip outlets. We tweet, we FaceTime, we dark web, we chat, proclaim, and intervene endlessly. The hierarchy of investigative journalism has given way to a speed of lightning gossip regurgitation from whoever anonymous keyboard warrior who chooses to put out a message, whether the famous Russian bots to be paid for political targeting or Cambridge, the infamous now Cambridge Analytica. And our political leading class have, of course, been seduced and made use of the opportunities to speak directly with their voters. President Trump, so-called at the time, conversed with his nation via Twitter until he was banned. He churned out his tweet fragments with their claims and incitements with uncharacteristic diligence. These brief sound bites, laden with insinuation, grievance, and promise, gave him the keys to the White House, a terrifying outcome. And the UK's own Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, I call him Mini Trump, departs from established truths with near impunity. He claims whatever he needs to in the moment, contradictory or nonsensical. And the terrifying reality is his audience swallows his claims. Trump and Johnson are surfing the waves of social media. They know there is no fact checking of a tweet, and any single claim they make will swim instantaneously into a multitude of channels. And as readers, we have no way of knowing what is a big lie and what may approximate reality. Why, for instance, does Elon Musk want to buy Twitter and reinstate Trump's account? Because he knows these cheap, easy sound bites are now the seat of power. Chillingly are now the seat of power. Tweeting is the new oratory. He who tweets wins, like Trump's single boastful sentences. But I think there is a much deeper motive beyond the lies and power grabbing. The fake news and fake politicians use powerful persuasion and suggestion, which helps us, as my previous two speakers have been talking about, avoid painful truths, all of us, including psychoanalysts. A global abuse of power where the wealthy are basically exploiting the poor, the sick, the vulnerable, women, black people, workers and children, and refugees have, under this fake, unregulated capitalism, become seen as weak, disenfranchised, as a weak, disenfranchised other who is exploited. I believe that the misinformation and the plethora of online platforms are replete with examples of false information, the other, the weak. The whistleblowers I work with, and I've seen since I started doing this interesting work on a Friday in London, I've seen about 350 people as part of my practice, provide an alternative perspective. They talk, they dare to do what most of us don't do, okay? They dare to talk truth to power. They have the courage. They do not remain silent against fakery. Hospital managers, workers, and people who expose faulty workmanship in emergency vehicles. Ethicists like lawyers who are straight and interested in something other than money, who expose fraud. And good old Greta Thunberg, an icon for us all. These are people who aren't frightened to speak out. I might say this is how unfettered, unrestrained capitalism works. Everything, as Marcuse predicted, under this type of economy, where everything becomes a one-dimensionalized commodity. Even truth is commodified and turned into one line. Fake news, therefore, is a commodified symptom of our current social malaise, providing often superficial and endless options and opinions that become exhausting, and like a new opium of the people, overwhelm the capacity to think. We drown in information, going from one idea to another, unable to process anything before another idea arrives, adding to the complete difficulty of really thinking about complex subjects. Trump and Boris Johnson's lies are too legion to go into, so I won't. But the big liars, like they are, expand fake news to bolster their positions, perhaps having lost any awareness of their own truth. They know somewhere they are perhaps empty vessels, and fill this emptiness with fake new lies and rhetoric to seduce others. The seduction is necessary, otherwise, like the emperor's new clothes story, this underlying emptiness, like the emperor's no clothes, would be exposed. It is us who have to be dispossessed of the truth. Our need for serious thought, which is painful and difficult, emptied out, which of course we may welcome. Like the emperor's new clothes story, the emperor's courtiers who know he is naked have to collude with the fake news and the falseness that he is clothed to maintain their positions. Otherwise, they will lose their positions. Why whistleblowers have lost their jobs, their mortgages, all sorts of things in the name of standing up to truth. Okay, some of them against the fake news industry. It is disturbing to see through the veneer and easier for all of us, I think, to collude with the fakery. Otherwise, we have to face the anxiety that those in charge often don't know what they're doing. This uncertainty mirrors the fear of the void that I think the empty fake leader is actually frightened of facing, and fill the gap and the void with simplistic tweets, certainties, and MAGA baseball hats and in our country, Brexit lies. Lying shields us from our vulnerability to our own unconscious desires, but it also corrodes a shared reality. Lies wield the power to create their own reality, blessedly free of uncertainty. It relieves us of our uncertainty if we just believe, and the unpleasant consequences of telling the truth dissolves in the comforting illusions being offered, e.g., there is no climate change. It's a conspiracy. Oh, good, that's a relief. People lie or create false narratives because they don't believe anyone can tolerate their truth. Politicians lie because they know at some level that they are bereft themselves of real substance, victims of an education or upbringing where power and love of it was actually paramount, where a false self was perhaps overvalued and thinking devalued. The dictum, the bigger the lie, the more people are likely to believe it, rules. They feel they have nothing else, I believe, and they feel they have no truth except of their lies. So there's some truth in lying because they don't really think anybody could bear or tolerate or has been able to tolerate their truth. I want to add also, this involves some of the people I have seen, that for the producer of false lies and propaganda, there is an excitement when they see others trapped by their lies and fake stories. There's an excitement involved in all that. A journalist, and I've had permission to use this, so I'm not putting it out there in a false way. A journalist I used to see went from serious journalism to the gutter press, and became very excited by his capacity to plant stories for extraordinary amounts of money that he knew had very little valiancy. They sold extremely well. He became, in a healthy way, rather depressed by the job that he was doing and developed a psychotic belief that there was music emanating from the radiators in his workplace. It was fairly clear to me that the music of this man's soul, his honesty, something truthful, had been externalized into a warm radiator, but in human place. In his analysis, he had first brought his paranoid fear of exposure by his analysis. I was intent on using him as a story, which of course at some level I am now, but in an unscrupulous way. As it transpired many sessions later, what he feared was his own internal reportage of his own loss of a serious, thoughtful, creative aspect of himself, the music, the beautiful music that came out of the radiators, that slowly gave him insight into the falseness of what he had been doing. He became, in a way, his own whistleblower. I won't go too much into this narrative, but this need for insight into his own way of lying and creating false news was an important part of his work with me. When faced with insight into their own calumny, there is a wish to evacuate any insight into the messenger, crying, as Trump often does, fake news, in an attempt to avoid insight or scrutiny into their behavior. They pathologize others. My patient gave me the feeling that his analysis may become a sensational story and an exposure of my exploiting him. The frightening lurch to the right wing in many countries, with all its certainties and the accompanying mendacious manipulation of truth to maintain it, is occurring in the face of the huge uncertainties that face us, such as climate change, and its accompanying awareness of our own mortality and the end of human existence on our planet. It is too painful to think about. I was thinking about Jennifer and her schools and the classrooms or lecture halls. How does one talk about these issues, which are so overwhelming and frightening and create such anxiety? I guess really all of us wish these unbelievable realities were fake news. But unfortunately, it's the painful truth. And the truth, which is something I think we have to acknowledge in this podcast, is sometimes just unbearable. And I can really see the attraction of fake thinking and suggestions to the contrary. And that's what fake news provides, a distraction from unbearable truths, which all of us at the moment, I think, in our lives are facing. The end of the planet or certainly human occupation of the planet, is very, very, very real. It's like the character in the Matrix film who prefers the illusion of being kept in his delusions rather than face reality off the machine. I can completely understand it, and I have some sort of sympathy for looking for stories that counteract, I think, the horror of some of the truths we now have to face. How do we build that into education, Jennifer, with your idea about education? This real life and death anxiety we're facing requires grown-ups who can think. And my colleague, Phil Stokoe, who does a political mind seminar, wrote a lovely paper called Where Have All the Adults Gone? It requires grown-ups who can think, not the shallow, reassuring, infantile certainties of leaders providing their version of fake news, helped by a press and internet intent on garnering easy followers with shallow polemics that these hollow leaders and supporters espouse. He who tweets wins. They are symptoms of our fear, whether it's peddling nationalism or simplistic ideas, as did Hitler responding to Germany's depression after the First World War. One antidote to fear are rules to follow, or certainties to follow, particularly if those certainties provide a scapegoat into whom all blame and uncertainty can be evacuated. We can avoid climate change and the threat to our own habitat by externalizing our fear and anxiety into refugees, and they become the threat, rather than just the first wave of people who are victims of climate change, looking for a place to be. We do not have to think, because all the fault is in those thoughtless others, the refugee, the victims of our unregulated economics, rather than having to face the complex thinking that insight into the damaging effect of our thoughtless economics requires, like America and the UK in particular with their colonialism. Fake news and propaganda provides the forum for this to happen. It's so painful to see the emptiness and the fear that lies underneath. But what gaineth a man if he gaineth the whole world and loses his soul? So our politics at the moment, according to Money Curl, an English analyst, needs to be marked by an abiding commitment to complexity, which of course fake news is a huge threat to. We must retain, he says, a genuine political and psychic vigilance in the face of the insidious violence of oversimplification. But we must also understand that oversimplification does provide a distraction from extremely painful truths that most of us find difficult to bear. I finally moved from a petrol car to an electric car. Okay, it's taken me ages. Okay, I'm supposed to be able to think about these things. Why did it take me so long? And many of my colleagues are saying, okay. So propaganda, fake news, if I could find fake news that said petrol cars were okay, it would have helped, you see, because it's a method of inducing a sort of temporary psychosis. And the propaganda provides some sort of distraction from, I think, the fear of looking into something extremely painful and difficult. Right now, a thoughtless economic market-driven economy is destroying our habitat. It's painful to have this insight, as we might have to change our behavior. But this can be obviated through the big lie offered by those who want this economic rape of our planet to continue, as covered beautifully by Sally Weintraub in her book about climate change disavowal. Turning a blind eye is much easier. So we are provided with false assurances that distract us from the inevitability of our own fate, in the same way that religions provided the ultimate false good news of pie in the sky heaven to obviate the painful realities of life and death. Many who believe in this fake news are supporters of Trump, and supporters of repealing the abortion laws, often in the name of their beliefs. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its power to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state, Adolf Hitler. This is an excellent definition of the big lie, the original description of the big lie being used as a way of attacking other people's truth. At the moment, we see a huge lurch towards certainty, the sort of certainty provided by fascist governments, a longing for unthinking uncertainty in the world, where the Machiavellian principle, the end justifies the means, dominates. Anti-democratic thinkers like Stephen Bannon and Surkov from Russia, who are ambivalent about democracy, are only interested in keeping their demigods in power. False news offers lies in order to forge an alternative reality, impervious to doubt or contradiction. It's not a coincidence that political leaders who lie must persistently commonly be known as strong men. Trump masquerades as a strong man. In driving truth from public discourse, they can eliminate their opponent's most potent weapon, the capacity to think deeply. Okay? Like borderline patients, my journalist had a capacity to maintain his own omnipotent belief system by plastering over huge internal insecurity with a psychic muscle that was able to evacuate anything that might make him aware of emotional insight into himself and into the minds of others. There was a reciprocal relationship with his audience who swallowed these projections and could avoid their own anxieties in the process. I would say, coming to an end, many politicians like Trump are aware that they are empty of any real substance. He was actually asked, I saw an interview, it's not false news, whether he'd ever thought about having psychotherapy, and he said, I'd be far too frightened of what I might discover. They're empty of any real substance, any adult's capacity to think. So they rely on projecting this emptiness into others, seeing others in their own image, through use of propaganda, creating a false enemies. So all badness and thoughtlessness and mendacious behavior is then projected into this other as a distraction from the actual emptiness of the orator. It is the other who is thoughtless and has to be resisted, not a resistant into insight and into their incapacity to think. Problem is, of course, unlike my journalist who had the decency to have a breakdown, living in his fake news empire, he needed something real. The people I'm talking about are unlikely to have that sort of crisis. So we have to vote, use your vote. We have to vote for people who can think, not people who obviate thinking with false news. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you to the three of you for these amazing presentations. Before going to respond comments and questions from the audience, I would like to invite the three of our esteemed panelists to discuss between them the ideas they have brought today, and well, what do you think about the others panelists' ideas, and well, to discuss freely between you. Who would like to start?
Well, I see so many resonating themes between all three of the presentations. Yeah. And one thing I didn't say is like we turn to education as a solution, but it's also very much embedded in the problem. Particularly here, there's cultural war. You can't teach climate change depending on where you live. You're not allowed to talk about the history of colonialism or structural racism. And so creating this mythic path to a misunderstanding and misapprehension of the past makes it almost impossible to navigate the present. So just to kind of put that out there, that I feel like I sounded very idealist, and I loved, David, how you were picking up on it, but it's also like, you know, really, can we be hopeful? What can we really hope from education and psychoanalysis? It's just something I felt the need to share, but I don't want to direct the conversation. Anything anybody wants to contribute would be great.
No, I find your talk, Jennifer, really helpful, and the emphasis on education, on helping people develop emotional intelligence through literature and poetry and all that sort of thing. But we've just said something very important. The whole education system has a defensive mechanism built into it to prevent mourning, to prevent sadness, to prevent insight into what has created this sort of belief, this certainty, and this way of thinking about the world. That doesn't have to involve any sort of awareness of the damage that has been done. You know? And that is extremely difficult. it does create this distraction, the way of distracting oneself from a very difficult truth that we have to face.
I also think that we have so many points in common that it would be interesting to develop these points, but it's very difficult to do this at this moment. But I have a complicated question to reflect, which is a side question. It's not in the center of our discussion, because both of you mentioned that capitalism is part of the problem. And
regulate.
I have a question. Do you think that capitalism is a problem in itself, or is a symptom of narcissism? Because if you have a narcissistic culture, the way we build the economical structure will also be a capitalistic, or anything we can call a narcissistic structure. What we have is a very voracious structure that tends to disdain the other. The other is not important at all. And my proposition is that maybe any kind of economical politics, or any kind of economic solution, if based on narcissism, would be the same. My question then is if we are talking about the symptom of the narcissistic culture, or anything else, or an autonomous idea. But I noticed this side question is a very complicated question.
Yeah, I mean, Britain, of course, is a little bit behind America in the development of neoliberal economy. So we still have a free NHS. We still have a welfare state. People aren't dying on the streets for lack of medical care. There isn't this sort of class cull going on that people with money get medical care and poor people don't. But it's changing slowly, as the sort of capitalism you're talking about, Jose, is taking over, which is a form of Darwinism. It's a sort of Darwinistic social Darwinism, not Darwin. It's a form of the winner takes all, and the losers go to the wall. And it's very disturbing. In this country, we've had a safety net for people who fail or can't cope, who need help. But that is beginning to disappear. And that's why I think the attraction towards fascism, which is a splitting off the people who have from the people who have not, begins to occur. I think it's partly driven by anxiety. I think greed, the need to become a have more, as Bush talked about, the haves and the have mores. To have a have more is partly driven by greed, which I think is an anxiety about thinking, knowing somewhere that there's an emptiness in materialism. Okay. And somehow it's addressing that anxiety that you can't deal with that emptiness by acquiring more and more and more, and living off schadenfreude because other people have less than you. Sorry, Jennifer, I'm talking to you.
Well, no, I mean, I appreciate that too. And Jose Carlos, your question is exceedingly difficult. I mean, capitalism is a direct outgrowth of colonialism. So what kind of personality created that? But I do feel like the increasing polarization and the rise of hate and alt-right movements here and around the globe is a direct result of diminished social needs being met. I mean, if people weren't afraid of, breaking their arm or getting COVID-19 and having billions or whatever disease or ailment can befall one in the context of the US anyway, where you're fearing for your livelihood. People aren't getting paid a living wage. Education is, a sham in so many places, that it's people just, I think, are definitely afraid. And that if we had sort of a more bottom line or a safety net that you were speaking of, David, I don't think that the narcissism would be as powerfully taken in.
Yeah.
I want to believe that a mass social structural change would produce different kinds of ways of thinking and seeing and being in the world. Yeah. You look skeptical.
I've seen it in the UK, because we did have a wonderful welfare system, you know, but it's under attack, you know. And yes, if you do live in an all or nothing world where your health depends upon your job, you're never going to be critical. You have to become somebody who becomes institutionalized, because your whole security depends upon that investment, you know. And yes, you know, living in a country without that safety net must be very frightening for people. And with guns too. I mean, that's the whole thing about the cutting down on abortion rights. On the one hand, every life is sacred, and the gun lobby on the other, I think, just sums it all up, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
gun lobby is a huge industry, and it's an industry that's more important than human life.
Mhm.
I have another point that I think I would like to stress is the importance of technology in the theme we are talking.
Yeah.
Because because lies have been part of the world and part of human being since we know human being has been here. We know that lies are here, and fake news has always been a certain way of trying to dominate, to trying to empower certain people. So it has always been like that. But now we have a difference. We have a technology that is able to manipulate in certain directions. And I think what we are talking by the danger of fake news and the culture of fake news is connected to this hyper technology, which is manipulating the building of culture, which this is different from everything that has been there before. We have equilibrium by different sources of the society to what was supposed to be truth and false, and security and violence, and everything was in a kind of way related and regulated. At this moment, we can manipulate in the direction we want to, and I think this is quite different from what has been until now. This is my opinion.
Yeah, I think we all agree, probably.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, although, I mean, what scares me too is like the replacement of human connection via technology. And so many of us are still invested in, oh, technology will save us, right? But it's really, I think, maybe what's leading us down this path of destruction. But it is interesting to think about. I think both of you talked about how like fake news, or what we used to think about as rumor or gossip or scandal, like things that have no foundation, how powerful they are. So Mladen Dolar has a paper called On Gossip, Rumor, and Philosophy, or something along those lines. And he gives really powerful, like he points out how Socrates, you know, could not name his accusers, and he was fighting with shadows because the rumor sticks, even if there's no foundation. And he gives powerful examples from Shakespeare or Kafka. So this has been going on for centuries, and yet, you know, at the same time, it certainly is taking on a new flavor with technology. I mean, what is becoming of AI and you know, people having relationships with an app instead of a person? I mean, that is very, very strange and quite alarming to me. So thank you for that point too, Jose Carlos.
Well, so now I would like to read some questions to enrich the discussion. Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to read 3 questions so you can keep discussing. The first one is, what is suggested when the main news sources have an editorial and are partially true? The second question, is bias can fall into fake news? And the third, this one is addressed to Jennifer. Psychoanalysis is a theory of conflict. However, as Jennifer has mentioned, each person will have their own biases and partisan belief. In conflict or war, each side believes that the truth and the right are on their side. And if that is true, how do you know what is true? When each side has its own narrative and belief system.
So where should we start? In order or in back order?
I can start by you. Do you have a direct question?
I have a direct question. So how do you know what is true you don't? I mean, and that's the point, and particularly in education, I mean, it's complicated. I have offended students by, disclosing that I'm left of left. Criticize Trump, oh my goodness, suddenly you're going to, the student's not going to want to learn from you. And that's not what I'm there to do. I don't want to shut down learning. I want to invite learning. So the point is to, invite exploration about what are the feelings behind our reasons for believing what we do, right? And then you'll find out that people on the right or the left, they both want to be good people. They both are afraid of something, right? So you can recognize what the common denominator is on the polarization. I mean, I know I'm idealizing, but I would say, that ultimately we do not know what is true. And this is why we want to be able to dialogue across difference to get a better understanding of the motivations behind people's beliefs.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, completely. I mean, it's fostering. We might have certain views that we hold strongly, but it doesn't mean that we can't be curious about why other people hold their views. It's actually the epistemological instinct that one can actually be curious in the views of others, rather than becoming polarized, which is what's happening so much, I think.
Right, and it takes more courage to, like, this is a quote from Nietzsche that I've always appreciated. Like, what is courage? It's not to have the belief of your convictions, but it's to have the courage for an attack on your convictions, right? Absolutely. Are you willing to step outside of your comfort zone? And this is why ignorance is so important, or epistemic vulnerability. People who just want to be right. I think that's where the problem might lie, not in what is right or wrong or what is true or not true, right? How do your beliefs operate for you? Also, we could think about what is the function of what I believe? What is what I believe doing to other people?
Yes, yeah.
But to have conversations like that.
Yeah. And adding something, I think truth is a search. It's nothing that you know from the beginning. Maybe you have to take your whole life to know what is the truth, and maybe you're not going to get there. But the point is searching the truth and being courage enough to be able to, as Jennifer said, to confront what you believed it was the truth before and change with new elements and new evidences and new reflections, and avoiding to be convinced by truth by a certain thought, a certain predominant thought or unique thought, which I think is another problem at this moment, that we have to accept a unique thought, which make us have to face and be always confronting, which is necessary. But so truth is a search, is nothing that you can know where it is or where it's not. And you better have good sources also.
I mean, one of the problems is that trauma has the effect of disabling people's capacity to symbolize, and because of that, they're then attracted to black and white thinking. They're attracted to fundamentalism to get away from trauma. That's the problem. So fundamentalism is the alternative to thinking. It gives you rules and things to follow. And I utterly understand that people coming from traumatized backgrounds, why that sense of certainty, the black and white thinking and fundamentalism attracts them. Part of my work has been working with refugees, and it's extremely difficult where you see people becoming inculcated with religious ideology. But you can see it provides hope, it provides certainty in a way that thinking about feelings, emotions, and uncertainty doesn't. As a way of managing trauma, that black and white thinking is a pretty strong antidote, and that's what people like Trump understand.
But David, I'll be safer if we knew that only traumatized people are affected by fake news and all this. I think that you're right that traumatized people can be more fragile and more prone to be affected. But we have other problems at this moment. For instance, I think this tribal thinking that we have in our society is promoting this black and white thinking also. And this is not related to trauma. This is related to a kind of seizures that we have in the society.
Yes, no, I agree. I mean, but the trauma is partly created by a society that behaves thoughtlessly. So, it doesn't. If you want, I always say, if you want people to behave thoughtlessly towards others, you have to give them the experience of being thought about. And I don't think that is something, as Jennifer is describing in the American society at the moment, the anxiety around health and healthcare doesn't foster a feeling of being cared for, thought about. It's a very uncaring society in some ways, and that's traumatic. I think that's where the trauma begins.
If we have, let's call it this way, if we have a good object inside, we are able to wait and be curious enough, because good object also stimulates curiosity. So we're going to be able to keep curiosity and able to face uncertainties, which puts us in a very more comfortable, so to say, position to face what we don't know, what we need to search, instead of having to accept some bias or some unique thought.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, so somebody was asking something about partial truths, and I think maybe that's what we all have access to. And I love the idea that truth is a search, and we think we found it one day, but then it's going to change the other day or the other year or decade or what have you. But so this idea that we all just have a partial truth might help recover a better sense of solidarity, to recognize that we are all beset by ignorance and different kinds of not knowing and emotional investments in what we believe. Because it's really easy. I mean, hate is just tangible in so many debates in so many different spaces, whether it's, freedom of speech and what does that mean? I mean, are we protecting the right for people to say hate speech? And abortion right now. I mean, this is, I mean, just the left-right divide here. I don't know that I've ever lived through it as palpably as now, but maybe it just feels that way to me too. I always try to remind myself of history, but I like the idea of partial truth. Everybody wants to have a grasp of the whole truth, and I think that when they think they've got it, that's problem. That's where the problem is. So maybe we want to promote. But then I feel like that's a scary thing too, because what about objective fact and scientific knowledge and things we want to take for granted? So it's a bit of a predicament. Sorry to interrupt if you were saying something.
Sorry to go ahead, Jose Carlos. We have a few minutes left. Briefly, please.
Yeah, I would just like to add that we only have partial truths. That's everything we can have. We cannot have anything else than that. And we have to be very glad that we have partial truth instead of a whole lie.
It would be overwhelming to know everything, wouldn't it?
Not only overwhelming, it's impossible to do it.
Yeah, of course.
We cannot reach it. We cannot know it. The problem at this point is not having partial truth. This is good. The problem is having a total lie. And maybe this would be a good debate.
Well
And
said.
well, maybe as David said, even if we had the access to all the truth, well, it will be unbearable. I think so. Maybe it's good to have a partial access to the truth.
One of the problems is that the people who we elect, people who get into power, who manage the anxiety, I think, in the world by providing black and white thinking. That's the trouble. The people that vote for people, it'd be very hard to vote for a politician who came in and said, "Look, I'm not sure. It's really difficult. It's a really complex situation. We're going to have to spend a hell of a lot of time thinking about this." But they get into power, you see. So power forces people, due to their own anxiety, to become fundamentalists and black and white thinkers. That's a real issue, actually, that needs addressing.
Yeah, excellent point.
So, well, we have to finish because we're running out of time. Thank you very much for your presentations. If you're feeling like this always happens, right, that we would like to keep discussing about this. And if the audience is feeling like us, well, please join our LinkedIn discussion group where we can keep thinking about this interesting topic. Before saying goodbye, I would also like to remind you that today is the last day to send your proposal to our upcoming IPA Congress, Mind in the Line of Fire, that will be celebrated on July 2023 in Cartagena de Indias. And well, finally, I would like to announce our next webinar that will be on July 28th. And I'm waiting for the image, and the theme will be neutralities. Please save the date. Well, I would like to thank Jennifer, Jose Carlos, and David, and well, thanks to the audience for joining us, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing these ideas. Bye.
Great.
Thank you.
I might get you for political